The morning sun of August 4th, 1950, cast long shadows across the dusty Korean countryside as Private First Class Tommy Morrison crouched behind a hastily constructed sandbag barrier, his M1 Garand rifle trembling in his sweat-soaked hands. Behind him stretched the final defensive line of the United Nations forces, a thin crescent of desperate soldiers protecting the vital port city of Busan. If this line broke, there would be nowhere left to retreat. Morrison had arrived in Korea just 3 weeks earlier, fresh from basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. He had expected to be home by Christmas, but the North Korean People's Army had shattered those dreams along with most of the 8th United States Army's initial defensive positions. Now squeezed into a roughly rectangular area measuring 100 miles north to south and 50 miles east to west, the remnants of General Walton Walker's forces prepared for what many believed would be their final battle, the Busan perimeter. As military commanders had begun calling this last bastion of resistance, represented more than just a geographical boundary. It was the thin line between communist conquest and democratic survival on the Korean peninsula. The port of Busan itself served as the crucial lifeline through which men, supplies, and equipment flowed from Japan and the United States. Should it fall, the Korean War would effectively end with a North Korean victory. Colonel John Michaelis of the 27th Infantry Regiment watched through his binoculars as dust clouds on the horizon signaled the approach of North Korean tanks. The enemy had been relentless in their pursuit, having crossed the 38th parallel on June 25th and swept southward with lightning speed. Seoul had fallen within days, and successive defensive lines along the Han River, Kum River, and Naktong River had crumbled under the weight of the Korean People's Army's assault. As referenced in military historical archives from the United States Army Center of Military History, the situation had become so desperate that General Douglas MacArthur had seriously considered evacuating all United Nations forces from the peninsula entirely. The North Korean forces, numbering approximately 90,000 combat-ready troops supported by Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery, had pushed the combined United Nations forces, consisting of roughly 65,000 American, South Korean, and British Commonwealth troops, into an increasingly smaller pocket of resistance, the morning air filled with the distant rumble of approaching T-34 tanks, their distinctive diesel engines echoing across the valleys. Morrison checked his ammunition one more time. 8 clips of 8 rounds each, plus 2 hand grenades. Not much to stop an army, he thought grimly. Around him, other soldiers made similar preparations, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of men who had retreated too far and too fast. General Walker had issued his famous stand or die order just days earlier, telling his commanders that there would be no more withdrawals. The Naktong River to their west and the Taebaek Mountains to their north formed natural barriers, while the Korea Strait protected their southern and eastern flanks. This was where they would make their stand, where the fate of Korea, and perhaps the entire Cold War, would be decided. The first North Korean artillery shells began falling at 0600 hours, their explosions sending geysers of dirt and debris into the morning sky. Morrison pressed himself deeper into his foxhole as fragments whined overhead. Somewhere to his left, he could hear Sergeant Rodriguez calling out coordinates to the mortar teams. The battle for the Busan perimeter had begun, and with it, the fight that would determine whether the Korean peninsula would be unified under communist rule or remain divided between competing ideologies. As the bombardment intensified, Morrison thought about the letter from his mother that had arrived just yesterday, filled with news from their small Ohio farming town and questions about when he might be coming home. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, close to his heart, as the first North Korean infantry units appeared on the ridgeline ahead. The North Korean attack came with the methodical precision that had characterized their advance throughout the summer of 1950. Kim Il-sung's forces had learned from their victories at Seoul, Taejon, and dozens of smaller engagements that rapid, overwhelming assaults could break United Nations lines before defenders had time to establish effective resistance. But the Pusan perimeter was different here. There was nowhere left to retreat. Major General William Keane studied the tactical maps spread across his makeshift command post, a converted schoolhouse in the village of Masan. As commander of the Koti 25th Infantry Division, he bore responsibility for defending the southwestern sector of the perimeter, where intelligence reports indicated the North Koreans were massing for their main effort. The enemy had concentrated elements of the 4th, 6th, and 9th Divisions for what appeared to be a coordinated assault designed to punch through to Pusan itself. The first major engagement erupted near the village of Chindong-eni, where elements of the 24th Infantry Regiment came under heavy attack from North Korean forces advancing down the main coastal road. Captain James Houseman, serving as an advisor to South Korean forces, radioed desperate requests for artillery support as waves of enemy soldiers emerged from the early morning mist. The distinctive whistle of Soviet-made Katyusha rockets filled the air, their explosions walking systematically across the defensive positions. Lieutenant Colonel John Throckmorton's 1st Battalion found itself surrounded by midday, cut off from the main defensive line by a North Korean flanking maneuver through the mountainous terrain. His radio crackled with increasingly frantic messages from company commanders. Reporting enemy infiltration through their positions. The North Koreans had employed their favorite tactic of night movement and dawn attack, positioning themselves in the rear areas before launching their assault. As documented in official United States Marine Corps historical records, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade under Brigadier General Edward Craig received urgent orders to counterattack and restore the broken line. The Marines who had arrived in Korea just days earlier from their base at Camp Pendleton, California, represented one of the few fresh units available to General Walker. Their reputation for aggressive tactics and superior training made them the logical choice for the most dangerous missions. The Marine counterattack began at 1500 hours, with Corsair fighter bombers strafing North Korean positions ahead of the advancing infantry. Staff Sergeant Robert Taplett led his squad through the smoke and confusion, using hand signals to coordinate their movement through the rocky terrain. The Marines advanced by bounds, one fire team providing covering fire while another moved forward, their disciplined advance contrasting sharply with the desperate defensive fighting that had characterized most United Nations operations to this point. Private Morrison, now attached to a provisional company formed from stragglers and replacements, found himself swept up in the Marine advance. The difference in training and morale was immediately apparent. Where Army units had been falling back for weeks, the Marines attacked with aggressive confidence. Morrison watched in amazement as Marine Sergeant Chuck Rouse charged directly at a North Korean machine gun position, throwing a grenade with deadly accuracy before eliminating the surviving crew members with his Mo-1 carbine. The fighting intensified as both sides committed their reserves. North Korean reinforcements, including elements of the crack 105th Armored Division, moved forward with their T-34 tanks leading the assault. The distinctive silhouette of Soviet armor appeared through the smoke, their main guns traversing to engage individual fighting positions. The United Nations forces had learned to fear these tanks during the early weeks of the war, when American bazookas and recoilless rifles had proven largely ineffective against their thick frontal armor. But the defenders had advantages that previous engagements had lacked. Established supply lines through Pusan meant adequate ammunition and food for the first time since the war began. More importantly, United Nations air power could operate from secure bases in Japan, providing close air support that had been impossible during the chaotic retreat southward. F-80 shooting Starjets screamed overhead, their rockets and machine guns targeting North Korean armor and supply columns. By evening, The first day's fighting had established the pattern that would define the entire battle. North Korean forces would attack at dawn, achieving initial penetrations through aggressive infantry assaults supported by armor. United Nations forces would counterattack with Marine units and close air support, gradually restoring their defensive positions at heavy cost to both sides. The Naktong River ran red with blood as medics worked frantically to evacuate wounded soldiers from both armies. As darkness fell on August 4th, Morrison cleaned his rifle by the light of flares bursting overhead. Around him, exhausted soldiers dug deeper foxholes and checked their ammunition supplies. The North Koreans would attack again at dawn. They always attacked at dawn, and the thin line of defenders would have to hold once more. The fate of Korea, and perhaps the entire free world, depended on their ability to stand firm against the communist tide that threatened to sweep them into the sea. The distinctive silhouette of United States Navy transport ships appeared on the horizon at dawn on August 6, 1950, their gray hulls cutting through the choppy waters of the Korea Strait toward Pusan Harbor. Aboard the USS Midway, Brigadier General Edward Craig stood at the rail watching the Korean coastline grow larger, knowing that his 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was sailing toward what might become the most crucial battle in Marine Corps history since Iwo Jima. The Marines had been hastily assembled from units across the United States, many pulled from peacetime garrison duty at Camp Pendleton and other installations. Unlike the Army units already fighting in Korea, most of these Marines were experienced veterans of the Pacific War, men who had learned the brutal lessons of amphibious warfare against determined Asian opponents. Their equipment was newer, their training more recent, and their morale intact despite the grim reports filtering back from the Korean peninsula. As the ships docked at Pusan's crowded harbor, the Marines could see the evidence of desperate fighting just miles away. Artillery flashes lit the northern horizon, and the constant stream of ambulances and supply trucks spoke to the intensity of the ongoing battle. Sergeant Major Bradley looked over his men as they prepared to disembark, noting the mixture of excitement and apprehension on their faces. Most had joined the Marines expecting peacetime duty, but here they were, sailing toward what General MacArthur had described as the most important battle of the Cold War. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade consisted of the 5th Marine Regiment, reinforced with artillery, armor, and air support elements, approximately 5,000 men total. Their mission, as outlined by General Walker himself, was to serve as the 8th Army's mobile reserve, counterattacking wherever North Korean forces achieved penetrations of the Pusan perimeter. It was a role that would require rapid deployment, aggressive tactics, and the ability to fight outnumbered against experienced enemy forces. Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 5th Marines, established his headquarters in a former Japanese administrative building that still bore scars from the recent fighting. His staff officers spread maps across improvised tables, studying the tactical situation and identifying potential trouble spots along the perimeter. The North Koreans had demonstrated their ability to achieve surprise through night infiltration and coordinated attacks, making it essential for the Marine Reserve to remain ready for rapid deployment at any point along the defensive line. It is essential for the Marine Reserve to remain ready for rapid deployment at any point along the defensive line. Marines' first test came sooner than expected, as reports arrived of a major North Korean breakthrough near the village of Sachin on the southwestern edge of the perimeter. Elements of the North Korean 6th Division had overrun positions held by the exhausted 2nd Battalion, 24th Infantry, creating a gap in the defensive line that threatened to expose the entire left flank of the United Nations position. General Walker personally called General Craig, ordering the Marines to launch an immediate counterattack to restore the situation. As recorded in official Marine Corps combat histories, the brigade's first Korean operation began at 0400 hours on August 7th, with Marine units loading onto trucks for the 40-mile drive to the combat zone. The convoy moved through the darkness with headlights taped to prevent detection by North Korean infiltrators, passing streams of wounded soldiers being evacuated toward Busan. The contrast between the fresh Marines heading toward battle and the exhausted army units coming back spoke volumes about the desperate nature of the situation. Lieutenant Colonel George Newton's 1st Battalion deployed into attack positions before dawn, their movement coordinated with Marine Corsair fighter bombers already orbiting overhead. The Marines had brought their own close air support in the form of Marine Air Group 33, giving them tactical advantages that Army units had largely lacked during the retreat southward. The distinctive gull-winged Corsairs, flown by pilots who trained extensively with Marine ground units, could provide precise fire support that was impossible with Air Force jets operating from distant bases. The Marine attack jumped off at 0600 hours, with Newton's battalion advancing across open ground toward North Korean positions on Hill 255. The enemy had had time to dig in during the night, creating interlocking fields of fire that caught the Marines in deadly crossfires as they advanced. But unlike previous United Nations attacks, the Marines pressed forward despite heavy casualties. Their discipline and training evident in their coordinated movement and aggressive tactics. Private First Class Morrison, now attached to a Marine Rifle Company as a replacement, found himself advancing alongside men whose confidence contrasted sharply with the defeated attitude that had characterized much of the 8th Army during the long retreat. The Marines moved with practiced precision, using covering fire and movement techniques that Morrison had learned about in basic training but had rarely seen executed under combat conditions. When North Korean machine guns opened fire from concealed positions, Marine squad leaders responded immediately with flanking movements and close assault tactics. The fighting for Hill 255 continued throughout the morning, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties in the brutal heat and humidity of the Korean summer. North Korean defenders, many of them veterans of the Chinese Civil War, fought with desperate determination, knowing that failure might doom their entire offensive. But the Marines' superior firepower coordination gradually told, as Corsair strikes and artillery fire systematically reduced enemy positions while Marine riflemen closed for final assault. By noon on August 7th, the Marines had recaptured Hill 255 and restored the defensive line, but at significant cost. The 1st Battalion had suffered over 200 casualties in 6 hours of fighting, losses that would have crippled a less well-trained unit. But the Marines had demonstrated their ability to execute the aggressive counterattacks that would be essential if the Busan perimeter was to survive the continuing North Korean offensive. The Naktong River curved lazily through the Korean countryside west of Taegu, its brown waters providing the last natural barrier between North Korean forces and the heart of the Busan perimeter. Along its eastern bank, soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division had constructed a thin line of foxholes and fighting positions, knowing that beyond the river waited the bulk of Kim Il-sung's army, poised for what many believed would be the final assault that would drive United Nations forces into the sea. On the morning of August 11th, 1950, the river exploded into violent action as North Korean forces launched their most ambitious offensive of the war. Elements of the 4th Division, supported by Soviet-supplied artillery and armor, began crossing at multiple points along a 15-mile front. Their objective the vital communications hub of Taegu and the road networks that connected all sectors of the United Nations defensive line. Colonel John Michaelis watched through his binoculars as North Korean engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river under cover of heavy mortar fire. The 27th Infantry Regimental commander had positioned his men along commanding terrain overlooking the crossing sites, but the enemy's coordination and determination were evident in their willingness to sustain heavy casualties to establish bridgeheads on the eastern bank. The most serious penetration occurred near the village of Ohang, where North Korean forces achieved complete surprise by crossing the river before dawn and overwhelming outposts of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry. By mid-morning, enemy forces had advanced nearly 3 miles inland, creating a dangerous salient that threatened to unhinge the entire defensive position. This penetration, which American forces quickly dubbed the Naktung Bulge, represented the deepest North Korean advance since the establishment of the Pusan perimeter, according to military records from the United States Army's official histories. The North Korean success at the Naktung River resulted from careful planning and superior tactical intelligence. Enemy forces had spent days reconnoitering crossing sites and identifying weak points in the American defensive line. While there, engineers had prepared crossing equipment and established supply dumps on the western bank. When the assault began, it came with overwhelming force concentrated at carefully selected points. Private Morrison found himself part of a hastily assembled counterattack force drawn from rear echelon units and walking wounded who had returned to duty. The gravity of the situation was evident in the fact that cooks, clerks, and mechanics were being armed with rifles and sent forward to help contain the North Korean breakthrough. The normal chain of command had broken down as units became intermixed during the confused fighting, with lieutenants commanding companies and sergeants leading battalions. The fighting in the Naktung Bulge developed into the most vicious combat of the Korean War to that point, with both sides recognizing that the outcome might determine the fate of the entire peninsula. North Korean forces pushed eastward with desperate urgency, knowing that American reinforcements and air power would eventually concentrate against their exposed salient. United Nations troops fought with equal desperation, understanding that failure to contain the breakthrough might result in the collapse of their entire defensive position. Marine units from the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade received emergency orders to abandon their positions near Masan and move north to help contain the crisis. The Marines loaded onto trucks and raced through the night toward the Naktung River, their convoy stretching for miles along the dusty Korean roads. Brigadier General Craig established a forward command post just behind the threatened sector, coordinating with Army commanders to plan a counterattack that would eliminate the North Korean penetration. The counterattack began before dawn on August 5th, 10th, with Marine Corsairs striking North Korean positions while artillery from multiple battalions concentrated devastating fire on the enemy bridgeheads. The air-ground coordination that had become the hallmark of Marine operations proved decisive, as pilots who had trained extensively with ground units delivered precise strikes that disrupted North Korean communications and supply lines. Colonel Newton's Marine Battalion attacked from the south while elements of the 27th Infantry advanced from the north, attempting to pinch off the North Korean salient at its base near the river. The fighting was particularly intense around Hill 207, a commanding piece of terrain that dominated the crossing sites and had to be recaptured if the counterattack was to succeed. Marine and Army units advanced up the steep slopes under heavy fire, sustaining grievous casualties but pressing forward with grim determination. The battle for the Naktung Bulge raged for 6 days, with positions changing hands multiple times. As both sides fed reinforcements into the meat grinder, North Korean forces demonstrated their tactical competence by establishing strong defensive positions and coordinating their withdrawal when faced with overwhelming firepower. But the combined arms coordination of United Nations forces, particularly the integration of close air support with ground attacks, gradually wore down enemy resistance. By August 17th, the North Korean penetration had been eliminated and the defensive line along the Naktung River restored. But the cost had been enormous for both sides. The Marines alone had suffered over 800 casualties, while North Korean losses were estimated at over 3,000 killed and wounded. The Naktung Bulge had demonstrated both the vulnerability of extended defensive lines and the Effectiveness of rapid counterattacks when properly coordinated with air and artillery support. As Private Morrison cleaned his rifle that evening, he reflected on the transformation he had witnessed in himself and his fellow soldiers. The defeated, demoralized troops who had retreated to Pusan just weeks earlier had become hardened veterans capable of conducting complex offensive operations against determined opposition. The Pusan perimeter was holding, but the price of survival was being measured in blood along the banks of the Naktong River. The dawn sky over the Pusan perimeter erupted in thunder as waves of United Nations aircraft swept toward North Korean positions, their engines drowning out the sound of artillery and small arms fire that had become the constant soundtrack of the Korean War. From bases in Japan and from the decks of aircraft carriers operating in the Korea Strait, American, British, and Australian pilots launched around-the-clock operations designed to neutralize the communist offensive through the systematic application of overwhelming firepower. Major William Stratton adjusted his oxygen mask as his Fatey shooting star climbed through 15,000 feet, leading a flight of 4 jet fighters toward reported North Korean armor concentrations near the village of Wegwon. The Air Force had learned valuable lessons during the early weeks of the war, when close air support had been hampered by poor communications with ground units and unfamiliarity with Korean terrain. Now, forward air controllers embedded with frontline units provided real-time targeting information that allowed pilots to strike with devastating precision. The transformation of United Nations air operations had been dramatic since the establishment of the Pusan perimeter. During the chaotic retreat southward, Air Force units had operated from hastily prepared airstrips in Japan, limiting their time over Korean targets and reducing their effectiveness in the close air support role. But the establishment of forward operating bases within the perimeter itself, particularly at Taegu and Pohang, had revolutionized tactical aviation operations and given ground commanders responsive air support for the first time since the war began. Colonel Dean Hess, commanding the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing, studied reconnaissance photographs spread across his operations tent at Taegu Airfield. The pictures, taken by high-speed RF-80 reconnaissance jets, revealed extensive North Korean supply columns moving toward the front lines under cover of darkness. The enemy had adapted to daylight air attacks by conducting most movement at night, but infrared photography and radar-equipped night fighters were beginning to make even darkness provide little protection. As documented in official United States Air Force historical records, the air campaign over the Pusan perimeter represented the first large-scale application of jet aircraft in close air support operations. The F-80 shooting stars, with their speed and firepower advantages over propeller-driven aircraft, could deliver rockets and machine gun fire with unprecedented accuracy while remaining largely immune to North Korean anti-aircraft defenses. But the real revolution came with the coordination between air and ground forces. The Marine Corps had brought their own close air support assets in the form of Marine Air Group 33, flying the distinctive gull-winged 4U Corsairs that had proven so effective during the Pacific War, unlike Air Force pilots, who had trained primarily for strategic bombing and air-to-air combat. Marine aviators spent hundreds of hours practicing close air support with Marine ground units, learning to deliver ordnance within dangerously close proximity to friendly forces. Captain John Glenn, flying his Corsair over the Naktong River sector, received a radio call from a Marine forward air controller pinned down by North Korean machine guns in a village near the front lines. The controller, speaking in the calm, professional tones that had become standard for these dangerous missions, provided precise coordinates and described the target location relative to friendly positions just 50 yards away. Glenn rolled into his attack dive, his aircraft's 650 caliber machine guns chattering as he strafed the enemy positions with surgical precision. The effectiveness of close air support became legendary among ground troops who had previously felt abandoned by higher headquarters during the long retreat. Private Morrison watched in amazement as Air Force and Marine pilots repeatedly attacked North Korean positions that were sometimes closer than a football field to American foxholes. The pilots' willingness to accept tremendous risks in order to provide accurate fire support created a bond between air and ground forces that would characterize American military operations for decades to come. But the air war extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, as strategic bombers struck North Korean supply lines, communication centers, and industrial facilities throughout the peninsula. B-29 superfortresses, the same aircraft that had devastated Japanese cities during World War II, now flew daily missions against bridges, railroads, and supply depots that sustained the communist offensive. The bombing campaign was designed to strangle North Korean logistics and prevent reinforcements from reaching the front lines. The psychological impact of overwhelming air superiority proved as important as the physical destruction inflicted on North Korean forces. Enemy soldiers, accustomed to operating with relative impunity during their advance southward, now found themselves under constant aerial observation and attack. Daylight movement became virtually impossible in many sectors, forcing North Korean commanders to rely increasingly on night operations that reduced their tactical effectiveness and coordination. North Korean forces attempted to counter United Nations air superiority through camouflage, dispersion, and the construction of underground facilities, but their efforts proved largely ineffective against the volume and precision of American air attacks. Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft guns inflicted some casualties on United Nations aircraft, but not nearly enough to significantly reduce the intensity of air operations. The absence of North Korean Air Force opposition, their small fleet of propeller-driven fighters had been quickly eliminated, meant that American pilots could concentrate entirely on ground attack missions. By late August 1950, North Korean commanders found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation. Their offensive operations required concentration of forces and supplies that immediately attracted devastating air attacks, while dispersal for protection reduced their combat effectiveness below the level needed to break through United Nations defensive positions. The Pusan perimeter had become a killing ground where North Korean forces bled themselves white against defenders supported by the most effective close air support in military history. The air campaign's success created conditions for the eventual breakout from the Pusan perimeter, as North Korean forces were gradually worn down by the constant attrition imposed by round-the-clock air attacks. The lessons learned over the skies of southeastern Korea would influence American military doctrine for generations, establishing the integration of air and ground operations as the foundation of modern combined arms warfare. September 10, 1950, marked the beginning of what would prove to be the final North Korean offensive against the Pusan perimeter, a desperate all-or-nothing assault that Kim Il-sung hoped would finally drive United Nations forces into the sea before American reinforcements could arrive in decisive numbers. Across the entire 140-mile defensive line, North Korean forces launched coordinated attacks with the ferocity of men who understood that failure meant the end of their dreams of Korean unification under communist rule. The offensive began with the heaviest artillery bombardment of the Korean War to that point, as every available North Korean gun concentrated fire on United Nations positions along the Naktong River and in the northern sectors near Taegu. The pre-dawn darkness lit up with thousands of muzzle flashes as Soviet-supplied artillery pieces, mortar, and rocket launchers poured devastating fire onto defensive positions that had been under construction for weeks. Colonel Harold Moore, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Infantry, crouched in his command bunker as shells screamed overhead and exploded with earth-shaking violence throughout his defensive sector. The intensity of the bombardment exceeded anything he had experienced during World War II, and he could hear his radio operators struggling to maintain communications as enemy fire systematically targeted command posts and communication centers. Throughout the United Nations defensive system, the North Korean ground assault followed immediately after the artillery preparation, with waves of infantry supported by T-34 tanks advancing across the Naktong River at multiple crossing points. The enemy had concentrated their remaining armor, approximately 60 tanks, for this final offensive, hoping that overwhelming firepower at the point of attack would achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them during previous attempts to crack the Pusan perimeter. Private Morrison, now a battle-hardened veteran after weeks of continuous combat, watched through his rifle sights as North Korean soldiers emerged from the smoke and dust of the bombardment. The enemy infantry advanced with disciplined determination, using covering fire and movement techniques that spoke to their experience and training. But Morrison and his fellow soldiers had also learned from their prolonged combat experience, and their defensive positions incorporated lessons purchased with blood during previous battles. The most critical sector proved to be near the town of Yongsan, where North Korean forces achieved a significant penetration of United Nations lines and advanced nearly 5 miles toward the vital Taegu-Pusan highway. The loss of this crucial supply route would have effectively severed the northern and southern sectors of the perimeter, potentially leading to the collapse of the entire defensive position. General Walker personally took charge of the counterattack, committing his last reserves to restore the situation. As recorded in official United States Army histories, the crisis at Yongsan represented the closest North Korean forces came to achieving their objective of splitting the Pusan perimeter and forcing a United Nations evacuation. Enemy forces overran positions held by the 9th Infantry Regiment and advanced to within artillery range of the main supply route, creating panic among rear echelon units who began preparing for evacuation. Only the rapid deployment of Marine reserves prevented a complete breakthrough. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, already exhausted from weeks of continuous operations as the 8th Army's Fire Brigade, received orders to conduct yet another emergency counterattack to eliminate the North Korean penetration. Brigadier General Craig's men had become legendary throughout the United Nations forces for their ability to execute rapid offensive operations under the most adverse conditions, but the strain of constant combat was beginning to show in their reduced numbers and physical exhaustion. Colonel Murray's 5th Marine Regiment attacked the North Korean penetration from multiple directions, supported by every available aircraft and artillery piece within range. The Marines advanced through withering enemy fire with the same aggressive tactics that had characterized their operations since landing in Korea, but their casualties mounted steadily as North Korean forces fought with desperate determination to hold their gains. The battle for Yongsan raged for 3 days, with positions changing hands multiple times as both sides fed reinforcements into the savage fighting. North Korean commanders understood that failure to achieve decisive results during this offensive would mean the end of their hopes for Korean unification, while United Nations forces recognized that defeat might result in their complete ejection from the peninsula. The fighting took on an intensity that surpassed even the brutal combat that had characterized earlier battles. Marine close air support reached new levels of precision and effectiveness during the Yongsan battle as Corsair pilots flew continuous missions in direct support of ground troops, often engaged in hand-to-hand combat with North Korean forces. Captain Glenn and his fellow pilots developed techniques for delivering ordnance within yards of friendly positions, using colored smoke and radio communication to coordinate strikes that often determined the outcome of local tactical situations. Psychological strain of prolonged combat began to affect soldiers on both sides, as men who had been fighting continuously for weeks reached the limits of human endurance. Medical officers reported increasing numbers of combat fatigue cases, while unit commanders struggled to maintain discipline and morale among troops who had witnessed levels of violence and destruction that exceeded anything they had imagined possible. By September 13th, the North Korean offensive had exhausted itself against the stubborn resistance of United Nations forces, achieving only limited penetrations that were quickly contained by counterattacks. The enemy had committed their last reserves and expended their remaining supplies in the futile assault, leaving their forces scattered and demoralized across the Korean countryside. The breaking point had been reached, and it was the North Korean People's Army that had broken first. The failure of the September offensive marked the end of North Korean hopes for military unification of Korea, though this would not become apparent until General MacArthur's landing at Incheon rendered the entire strategic situation moot. But for the exhausted defenders of the Pusan perimeter, the repulse of the final communist assault represented validation of their weeks of sacrifice and suffering in the defense of democratic principles on the Korean peninsula. The morning of September 15th, 1950, dawned clear and calm along the Pusan perimeter, the relative quiet marking a stark contrast to the weeks of continuous combat that had raged across southeastern Korea. Private Morrison cleaned his rifle with practiced efficiency, noting how the routine maintenance had become second nature after 2 months of fighting that had transformed him from a green recruit into a seasoned combat veteran. Around him, other soldiers performed similar tasks, their movements reflecting the hard-won experience of men who had faced the enemy's best efforts and emerged victorious. Unknown to Morrison and his fellow defenders, General Douglas MacArthur's X-10th Corps was at that very moment conducting the amphibious landing at Incheon that would transform the entire strategic situation in Korea. The daring assault, launched far behind North Korean lines, had caught enemy forces completely by surprise and threatened to cut off their entire army south of the 38th parallel. But even without knowledge of these dramatic developments, the soldiers defending the Pusan perimeter could sense that something fundamental had changed in their tactical situation. General Walton Walker stood before his assembled division commanders in a briefing room at 8th Army headquarters, studying the intelligence reports that had been flowing in throughout the morning. North Korean forces, which had maintained aggressive pressure against the perimeter for over 6 weeks, had begun withdrawing from their forward positions during the night. Reconnaissance flights reported enemy columns moving northward along all major routes, abandoning equipment and supplies in their apparent haste to escape the trap that was closing around them. The withdrawal began slowly, with North Korean units conducting fighting retreats that maintained pressure on United Nations positions while gradually disengaging from close combat. Enemy commanders, realizing that MacArthur's landing at Incheon threatened their entire strategic position, had received orders to break contact with United Nations forces and race northward to avoid being cut off south of Seoul. But weeks of continuous combat had severely weakened North Korean units, making rapid movement difficult and coordination nearly impossible. Colonel Michaelis received orders to begin limited attacks to test North Korean defensive strength, probing actions designed to determine whether enemy forces were conducting tactical withdrawals or genuine strategic retreats. His 27th Infantry Regiment advanced cautiously across the Naktong River, meeting scattered resistance from North Korean rearguards, but finding most enemy positions abandoned. The contrast with previous operations was striking. Instead of fierce resistance to every advance, American forces encountered only token opposition. As documented in official United States Military Academy studies of the Korean War, the breakout from the Pusan perimeter represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern military history. Forces that had been compressed into an increasingly smaller defensive area suddenly found themselves advancing rapidly across terrain that had been contested yard by yard just days earlier. The transformation from desperate defense to aggressive pursuit occurred with stunning rapidity. The 1st Cavalry Division led the breakout toward Seoul, their armored spearheads racing northward along roads that had been clogged with retreating United Nations forces just weeks earlier. Tank commanders who had grown accustomed to defensive fighting from prepared positions now found themselves conducting pursuit operations across open terrain, their vehicles churning up clouds of dust as they pressed forward against crumbling North Korean resistance. Marine units, which had served as the 8th Army's mobile reserve throughout the siege, now spearheaded offensive operations designed to link up with MacArthur's forces advancing south from Incheon. The Marines, who had earned legendary reputations during defensive battles at the Naktung, Bulge and Yongsan, now demonstrated their offensive capabilities as they raced northward through increasingly demoralized North Korean forces. Private Morrison, riding in a truck convoy advancing toward Seoul, marveled at the transformation he witnessed in the Korean countryside. Villages that had been contested battlegrounds now welcomed United Nations forces as liberators, with civilians emerging from hiding to wave South Korean and American flags. The contrast with the grim defensive fighting of the previous weeks could not have been more complete. Instead of holding desperate defensive positions, Morrison found himself advancing rapidly through territory being abandoned by a beaten enemy. The psychological impact of the Incheon landing extended far beyond its immediate